Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Dune Class 10. We are now approaching the end of this book. We have tonight, and then we have one more class on the text, and then so we're going to go through the end of the book next time. Theoretically, there's a lot still to cover there at the end, but then we still have the one bonus class there at the end to finish things out and to take any last questions that you guys have. Last questions, I say, as if we're totally going to finish everybody's questions on Dune. They're in the last class. But anyhow, that's the plan. And then after that, we will be, soon thereafter, we'll be starting our next book, the last of our first series, the last of year one of the Mythgard Academy. And which reminds me, if you are in our voting pool for last year, this is the last election we're doing with the our old figures from last year's fundraiser, and voting is going on right now. So if you haven't voted yet, you should. But for those of you who aren't in our voting pool, the finalists for our next book there are four finalists. Watership Down by Richard Adams, The Book of Lost Tales Part 2 by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Princess Bride, and Watership Down by Richard Adams. This is a great selection. Yes, I know. I on purpose said Watership Down twice. That was a subtle. I'm trying to be subtle in my attempt to sway the vote. See, I've not been campaigning. I've been very good. But Watership Down has been a finalist now 3 times in a row, and I would love to talk about Watership Down. Anyway, but any of those 3 books actually would really be awesome. I mean, all of our finalist slates have been very good. This one I am especially excited about. There are no there are no duds on that list. So anyway, we will see. I should be able to announce the winner next week in next week's class. So I'm looking forward to that. On a related subject, of course, last week I announced that our fundraiser was officially launching for year 2 to keep the academy going. We started, as I announced and showed you the webpage. We have a $14,000 goal, either through a combination of lump sums and monthly pledges for the coming year, and that's pretty much what we need to keep the lights on, keep things running at Signum. As many of you know, we at Signum University, which is the parent institution of Mythgard, makes Mythgard possible. We're doing a lot of things, and one of the things we're really committed to is, for our regular classes, keeping our prices as low as possible, and for everything else, giving away as much as we can. That's why we've been doing these free classes, and we do as much of that kind of thing as we can, and that of course doesn't lead to highly lucrative turnover. So we really rely upon people's donations. And again, we set our goal for $14,000, and we have of course our costs have really risen since we started doing the free downloads thing. Of course, we're paying for the hosting of these files and for the downloading for everybody, and we really want to be able to keep that going. We certainly don't want to make anybody pay for those, but of course it's not free to us. So anyhow, we have scheduled like 6 weeks for this campaign, and the response from you guys has been amazing. I am amazed. I am astounded again. Let me just share this with you. These are our current standings. I'm actually being informed that this is slightly behind. Doesn't include pledges that have come in the last hour or so. So it's actually just a little bit higher than this. But as you can see, we're already at around 11.5 now. We're only $2,500 shy of our goal after 1 week of the campaign. It's been really wonderful. It's been just amazing. Which has led me to think, okay, well, let's let's think of some other things then. If we are able to raise our 14,000 to keep the lights on, there's some other stuff that we could do if we raised more money. Here's my idea. Tell me what you think of this idea. My idea was one of the things that a couple people have said with extreme politeness, I will add, is they're like, I've really been enjoying the classes, and it's fun and everything, doing classes with you, but it would also kind of be fun doing classes with other people sometimes. And I totally agree. The primary reason that we're doing classes with me is that this is basically my contribution to the fundraiser. I'm donating my time to do these classes. And those of you who have been involved with Signum University, those of you who have been students in our master's degree program will know I've talked about this a couple times to people in our program. There are really sort of two convictions that I have that really centrally inform our business model at Mythgard and Signum. And the first is to keep tuition as low as possible for students. I think that high tuition, especially tuition which compels students to take out loans and sell themselves as debt slaves, is horrible. And we're trying to do our part to make a difference there. So I don't want to charge much, but the other thing that I feel very strongly about is the way that so many faculty are exploited and terribly underpaid. Because there's so much competition. The job market is just awash in people who are qualified to teach for a series of other unscrupulous reasons. Many universities feel that they can get away with paying people almost nothing. And I think that's horrible. And I think that teachers deserve to get paid for what they do. And I don't want to be a part of that. So if I were to hire somebody else who wasn't me donating my time, I would want to pay them and to be able to pay them well. So that's one of the reasons why, well, that's the primary reason why the main classes have been me all the way through. But since we are sort of threatening to blow by our goal, in barely over the first week, here's my thought. My thought is, I would like to do a bonus lecture series, not necessarily extra courses, but one-off lectures by other people who are not me, to be able to bring in to have, again, free, open to the public lectures, just like all the rest of the Mythgard Academy stuff, from people. And I would actually really want to give our voters, to give our contributors, again, say in whom we get. What kind of topics would you like to hear about? Are there particular people, the particular teachers, scholars, writers that you would like to hear from, and see what we can do. See what we can put together. So we'll sort of think about that. I'll be announcing some sort of more specific details about this kind of thing. But I think this would be really fun. And again, so this is the kind of thing that we'd be enabled to do if we carry on and go further with the campaign. So it would be. I think this would be really fun. I would love to be able to host this. So we'll see. As I say, I'll announce more details later. But I just want to tell you that's sort of the direction that I'm thinking about this. I want to encourage you to spread the word. I've been really grateful, not only, of course, for the contributions, which are fantastic, but for the efforts of many of you to help to publicize it. I've been seeing people linking to our campaign page and sort of spreading the word on social media. And that's really helpful. So certainly, anything that you guys can do to help to spread the word, to let other people who love this kind of thing know, that would be great. Something we're really grateful for. Yes. Oh, and I've been reminded, of course, I do want to pause for a second before we'll shift to Dune here in a second. But I do want to pause for a second to wish a happy anniversary to Ed and Sharon Powell. Ed, our chair of the council, our mind of metal and wheels himself. So, and thanks, Ed, for all that you do. And I want to just make sure everybody knows how much Ed Powell has been doing behind the scenes here for the Mythgard Academy. Not only has he set up all of the technical arrangements for, devising the voting system and keeping everything together and making everything function, but of course he's also, arranged and is doing all of the technical side to put our campaign page together and make all of that happen. He has been just indefatigable behind the scenes in making the Mythgard Academy happen. So I am deeply grateful, Ed, to all of your work for this year, and I am honored that you guys are spending your anniversary at the Dune class with us. So anyway, let's talk about Dune. Let's move on to book 3, The Prophet. And I want to start with something quite similar to where we left off, which was, you remember near the end of class last time, we were talking about the scene with the Harkonnens and the Fenrings. We talked about the Fenrings and their humming language, which was fun. But then I was also looking at, of course, one of my favorite recurring elements in the book, which is the bowl and the Matador pictures, and seeing what Baron Harkonnen is doing with that. And in particular, we talked about that scene, which I subtitled "The Baron's Gaffe," the mistake that he makes, the blunder that he committed in front of Count Fenring, and we did some sort of I did some speculation about that. So, of course, we start book 3 with Baron Harkonnen and Feyd-Rautha and Thufir Hawat, and I want to talk a little bit more about those scenes and what we see in those, because I think this is one. I've been bringing up several times that there have been numerous occasions on which I've been trying to, well, not quantify, but at least demonstrate clearly the kinds of thing that I think make this book so brilliant. To try to at least point to some of the elements that I think make this book such a fascinating read. And one of the things that we get, well, let me show you the first passage here. So, okay. So this is context of this. This is right after Feyd-Rautha has been caught in his assassination attempt of the Baron, and he so he thinks, he's worried that he's about to be killed. This passage comes when the Baron and Feyd-Rautha are marching out, and the Baron is making him walk in front of him so that he can't see what he's doing. He thinks he might get stabbed in the back at any second. So it's certainly for Feyd-Rautha a very tense moment. And the Baron starts this line of conversation. "They've a new prophet, or religious leader of some kind among the Fremen," the Baron said. "They call him Muad'Dib. Very funny, really. It means the mouse. I've told Raban to let them have their religion. It'll keep them occupied." "That's very interesting, Uncle," Feyd-Rautha said. He turned into the private corridor to his uncle's quarters, wondering, why does he talk about religion? Is it some subtle hint to me? "Yes, isn't it?" the Baron said. Now, what I love about this passage is the complexity of our own sort of interpretive grid as we are looking at this. Remember, in this chapter, throughout here, we are jumping back and forth from Feyd-Rautha's head to Baron Harkonnen's head very rapidly, right? We get what almost amounts to running commentary by each one of them, which at times almost sounds like a second conversation that's going on, though they're not hearing each other, right? Culminating in that one wonderful moment when Feyd-Rautha thinks, "Get on with it, old fool," and the Baron immediately says, "You you think of me as an old fool, right? Almost as if he heard the thought and is responding to it. He's not, right? Um, One of the things that I think there's several things that I think that is really interesting about this. But the main thing I want to focus on is sort of the progression, the way that this story and that narrative technique has developed over time. We have often been shown the inside of people's heads at various points. There have been numerous other scenes in which we've gotten more than one, the inside of more than one person's head, right? Philip Lord is recalling specifically Paul and Jessica's conversation at the end of book one. Certainly, that's one place where we really saw this, and we talked about that to some extent, and the effect that has, the impact that it has on us in sort of the way that serves in that conversation between Paul and Jessica as a cue to sort of interpret things, right? It shows us more clearly how differently they're looking at things, right? It shows us much more clearly than just their words do, the gaps between their understandings, right? Their outlooks there. Here, we get it more intensely than I remember anywhere else in this book. So as I said, as if we're reading, well, it's not even like two different conversations. It's more like reading three things at the same time, right? So on the one hand, we see more of it here. But at the same time, there's now this additional level that's been added to it, and that's what I really wanted to emphasize here. The Baron, apropos of nothing, brings up this new prophet or religious leader among the Fremen, right? And Feyd-Rautha, in his extremely neutral, behind his extremely neutral, that's very interesting, Uncle, which he says clearly because he doesn't know what to say, because he's trying to parse this, right? He's like, okay, what is he implying? This has to be like code for something. There's some kind of hint. There's some kind of innuendo here. There has to be some key to understand why he's saying this particular. He's not just making small talk, right? Certainly not in this context. So here's Feyd-Rautha, convinced that there's something behind it. And there probably is, right? But of course, we, as readers, see something else entirely behind it. So we have, on the one hand, the two people who are saying one thing, but both of them thinking other things, which we see, though they don't see each other's thoughts, but we do. And so that we already have a fairly complicated matrix through which to interpret their words, right? We know what they're thinking, and so knowing what they're thinking, we are given an insight into what are the hidden meanings, what is the implication behind their words, behind their conversation. So again, we're given these tools to read into it. Now, that kind of reading into is something we've been trained to do, right? Throughout by this time of the book. Remember back to that dinner party, right, at the Atreides' house just prior to the disaster, to the betrayal. We saw a lot of. We talked at the time about how many things there. Paul knew that things were going on, that something was happening, but we didn't know what. Like that, Anyway, there are several possible examples there, but again, so we're getting at the very least prompted to do that kind of interpretation, to think in those ways. It's not just what they say, but how they say it. Why did they bring up one particular thing? Are there particular words that they say? Like, remember the code that Paul and Jessica receive, right? That contains certain key words that they focus on. The content of the message is not even really relevant. What matters are the appearance of those key words. So again, that's a kind of cue to us. It's a kind of direction to us. We're prompted, we're invited at the very least to apply ourselves in this kind of way, to think with this kind of care about people's words. And certainly the Count Fenring scene, I should say, the Count and Lady Fenring. We certainly don't want to act as if Count Fenring is the only important one there. So we've got the Fenrings and the Baron and Fade. And I talked a little bit in the last class about the way in which Feyd-Rautha is deliberately enacting an allegory, right? He wants his actions interpreted. He is performing these things hoping that his own actions will be taken essentially metaphorically, right? He wants the idea that the poison was on the wrong knife. He wants them to be taking that and applying that and interpreting that. So again, we see all of these things. Kevin Morgan is pointing to the meeting of Stilgar and Jessica as well. Yeah, I agree. There's plenty there. Sometimes our attention isn't even drawn very heavily to it, but again, we've been sort of conditioned by this. Again, it's part of our training. By this point, we've not been Bene Gesserit trained, but we've been trained by the narrative to think this way. This scene, again, to me, is almost like overload, right? Because we're getting all of this extra information, not only their words, but their thoughts, and we have to interpret both their words and in a different way their thoughts in the same way, right? Presumably when they're thinking, they're not like using doublespeak to themselves, right? They're not just giving themselves subtle hints and sending themselves subtle messages, but yet we have to think about what they're thinking in connection with other people's words and thoughts, and especially, of course, behind the background of the entire thing, of this whole conversation between the Baron and Feyd-Rautha, lurks the figure of Thufir Hawat, right? Whose side is he on? He's playing both sides against the middle. We begin to see Thufir's own plans being laid, right, being played out. And again, we're invited to not only look past their words, but I think also look past their thoughts and to think, okay, what lies behind that? Where did that come from? Are they being manipulated by? Are they correct or incorrect in their assessment of things? Are they being themselves manipulated? And I think especially by Thufir Hawat. But then in this moment, we get another level entirely above that. Again, all of that stuff still going on, but then at the same time, we now have dramatic irony added to the entire thing. And that is, dramatic irony is when we, the reader, know more than the characters about what about what they say. So a character says something and it has a significance, we the readers perceive a significance in it that the character themselves don't see. And in this, sort of the classic example of dramatic irony is Oedipus, right? In Oedipus the King, when Oedipus says, things like, I here call down a curse upon whoever killed the old king, and of course it's him, right? And we know it's him. All the audience knows that because they all know the story of Oedipus already, right? So we all know that that Oedipus is calling down a curse upon himself, but he doesn't realize that, right? So that gap between his understanding of the significance of his own words and our understanding of the significance of his words, that's where dramatic irony lies. So of course we can see there's a heavy dramatic irony in this passage, right? I'm not even quite sure I understand why the Baron is bringing up Muad'Dib here. I suspect that Feyd-Rautha is quite correct, that there is some subtle hint to him here, that he's not just talking about something random and apparently inconsequential in order to make conversation and make Feyd nervous. That's, of course, possibly what, one of the factors there, but I don't think that's all of it. I sort of agree with Feyd. Though with Feyd, I'm not sure I see exactly what it is. But for us, as readers, this has an entirely different meaning, right? I mean, working from the bottom up. That's very interesting, Uncle. Yes, isn't it? The Baron said. To which we would reply, yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, Baron? It is way more interesting than you know. What wouldn't you know, Baron? What wouldn't you give, Baron, to know exactly how interesting the business about the rise of Muad'Dib is, both in the sense of the fact that it's Paul Atreides and he doesn't know, but also the the impact that Muad'Dib is going to have. How interesting this decision to let them have their religion. It'll keep them occupied. Yeah, it'll keep them occupied. It'll keep them occupied with destroying you. But anyway, yeah, it's so again we see this. He speaks of it. It means the mouse, right? We know what it means, right? They don't. He doesn't really know what it means. Yeah. I mean, yes, it means the mouse. It's not that he's inaccurate about that. But of course, we know what that means to the Fremen. We've talked about the naming scene, right? And the significance of that name. The Baron obviously doesn't know those things. He just thinks it's funny, right? He just that it fits. It seems to fit into the Baron with the whole mental picture he has of the Fremen, right? We've seen from the very beginning how dismissive the Baron is of the Fremen, right? How he considers them not only very few, but very worthless and not worth taking into consideration. So the fact that these ragtag bunches of idiots out in the desert are now worshiping this guy that they call the Mouse just seems to him like, that's the Fremen all over, right? That's the Baron's interpretation of this. Of course, we know the many, many ways in which the Baron's assessment of the situation is quite disastrously wrong. Nancy says it's so characteristic of the Baron to sneer at a mouse, too. Yeah, and James points out that a mouse is even a smaller threat than the rabbits. No way that a mouse would be able to stand up to the bees, right? Clearly. And Kevin, Morgan, I agree. It is really interesting how the Baron keeps stumbling into the facts of the situation. Again, it's one of the reasons why both of these two chapters are really rich in dramatic irony, right? But you'll notice what that means. I talked about our training, right? The way that the narrative has kind of prompted us all the way through. It's trained us to read it in particular ways, right? To do this the kind of active interpretation, which Paul is himself being trained to do by Thufir Hawat and Jessica primarily. This is so again, we're being conditioned and trained in that way, but also by what we have seen. And the way in which we've, all of the things that we've seen, which of course no other single character has seen all of the things that we've seen. Because of all the things that we've seen to this point, now we are in a position of knowing much more, right? So we can perceive layers of depth, layers of, we can now put things together in ways that nobody else can. The only person who does like that is Paul, right? There is a way, this is one of the couple ways in which the book, the sort of the jumping around into people's heads is kind of another one, in which the narrative itself, to some extent, and I don't want to go too far with it, but to some extent does, I think, emulate the experience of Paul's prescient vision. I've talked about this a little bit in the context of Princess Irulan's epigraphs, right? The chapter headers, the way in which we're given these glimpses of the future, but never a consistent glimpse, right? Never a contiguous narrative of the future, just the crests of that undulating kerchief of time, right? So we pick out a bit here and there and can use that to put together a picture. Anyway, so I've talked about it in that sense, but I think in here as well, remember how Paul so frequently has that experience where he sees the significance of things that people say and they don't understand what's at stake, right? They don't understand what's going on. They don't understand exactly why it's so important. But anyway, so I think that's why I wanted to sort of focus on this, less because of the significance of this moment for the plot, though of course it has some importance for the plot, but more just because of how Herbert is handling the narrative here. And I just think that this is so cool. It's really fun to talk about. Good. So interesting. Carol in Morehouse is saying the Baron being so enormous reminds her of it puts her in mind of sort of the comical stories of an elephant being frightened by a mouse. Yeah, Carolyn, I think that there is a kind of irony there. It's not that I necessarily think that Herbert is deliberately attempting to invoke, elephant and mouse specifically, um, but Carolyn, it certainly does fit with the larger picture, right? Certainly with the larger picture of the Baron's worldview, for instance, right? It's not only that he is enormously fat, but he believes himself to be enormously powerful. Remember, does anyone remember the first image we're given of the Baron Harkonnen? What is Baron Harkonnen doing the first time we meet him? Do you remember? Remember that his opening scene? This is a kind of an unfair question to ask. It requires an above and beyond level of recall that is not really reasonable to ask. So don't feel bad if you can't peg this. But does anyone happen to remember? Nancy, yeah, he's sitting in the dark. Yeah, there's food involved, Carissa. Yeah, there always is. Yeah, Stephen, you've got it. He's got that globe of Arrakis, and he's reaching out his fat, beringed hand, and he's spinning and stopping the globe, the of Arrakis. Um, to some extent, this seems to me, in retrospect, a, a really interesting glimpse of the Baron's own sort of worldview, right? His own sort of sense of himself, really. We looked at that scene, and I think one of the sort of the immediate significance or the immediate impact of that scene on our experience as readers is giving us a glimpse into the Baron, right? Helping us to understand what he's like. And that's where we get the first sort of sickening references to his pedophilia. We get his, we were talking at the time, remember, about the contrast with the Atreides, right? We've just been hearing about some of the comparatively noble things about the Atreides, and remember we were talking about, human versus animal back then in the first class, which seems so long ago, and indeed was 2.5 months ago. But anyway, so but that moment of him, he's huge, right? He believes he has Arrakis literally in the palm of his hand, right? He believes he has the situation entirely under control, and he can just reach out and stomp the world when he wants to, right? And then make it spin and dance to his will again. So in that sense, Carolyn, the sense in which this mouse that he overlooks, right, that he laughs at, is going to come back and quite terrify him before the end, seems to me a very poignant kind of thing, and an important element of this. It's funny because, of course, the Baron Harkonnen has been allied with the Emperor before, but of course we see in these two chapters how he is certainly not just in lockstep with the Emperor. We see him scheming against the Emperor, and the Emperor beginning to scheme against him. But at the same time, within the context of this story, the Emperor is never really as present, is never sort of quite as real as Baron Harkonnen is. He's been the central figure, not just the central most evil figure, which he certainly has been also, but he's the one who has really sort of stood for what Paul is overthrowing, what Leto was fighting against in the first place. And so again, Caroline, I'm coming back to that, your sort of elephant mouse image, and I do think that it is an important thing to see, that people believe, to all outside appearance, the idea of the Fremen rising up and taking down the Emperor would be more, sort of ludicrous than a mouse terrifying an elephant. But but of course, we see that's exactly what is going to happen. It all depends on your grid, right? It all depends on the point of view from which you look at things. Who is really controlling Arrakis, right? There's that very interesting conversation that Paul has with Gurney at the end, right? And Gurney's like, when Paul says, the spice is the most precious thing in the world to the guildsmen, and we control the spice. And Gurney's like, dude, no, you don't. The Harkonnens control the spice, right? They own Arrakis. And Paul's like, no, actually, they don't control it. We control it. And again, it's depends on how you look at things, right? The Baron Harkonnen believes he has Arrakis in his palm. He doesn't have Arrakis in his palm. He has no. I even like the sort of unintended, I believe, by the Baron, quite unintended, double entendre in the last sentence of that first paragraph. It'll keep them occupied. Again, I don't think the Baron is intending that, but even there, there's like this sort of delightfully sort of double meaning there, right? They are occupied by the Harkonnens, but they're going to the occupation is about to be shifting around. And I'm thinking forward to, Paul's talking about how he has the Harkonnens just where he wants them. So anyway, so this, I wouldn't call the what's going on here, this sort of layer upon layer of interpretation and implication and irony that we see so marvelously, I think, in this scene, but in many other places also. I'm not going to call it, a perception of depth, because that phrase has already been used. Tolkien used that phrase, and many more people have used it of Tolkien. And I think I've talked about it already in this class, because, of course, Frank Herbert does it quite well, too. The perception of depth, meaning that there is more to the story, that there is more to the world than what we see. The sense of untold stories and a long history and this sort of real experience, living experience that this world has that we're only scratching the surface of. That's what Tolkien meant by the perception of depth. But I'm not quite sure what to call this thing that I'm describing. It's not exactly depth. It's more like, I don't know, thickness, though that doesn't really convey it particularly well either. The thickness of the layering of one thing on top of another, so that in order to really sort of drill down through to what's really happening, right? What people are really saying and actually thinking, and all of those things become so challenging. Wheels within wheels, plans within plans, right? We see that happening on the narrative level in this way, as well as sort of in the minds of the people. One more Harkonnen scene, and this comes back to the Baron's gaffe that I was talking about with the Fenrings last time. So this is the Baron talking to Thufir Hawat, and this is Thufir's suggestion for the resolution to the situation where he's like, oh man, you told Count Fenring 2 years ago, you dropped that bomb 2 years ago, you laid that particular egg 2 years ago, and they've had all this time to prepare, and you don't have any idea, but doubtless they now, here are the conclusions they're drawing about what you're doing, and boy, do you look guilty. He says, we still have our he's just said, you either have to kill everybody or you'll have to cut off Rabban, right? Don't send him anything more. And the Baron says, well, what about the spice, right? He says, well, demand your spice. How do I know he's going to, pay up and everything? And Thufir says, we still have our spies on Arrakis. Tell Rabban he either meets the spice quotas or you set him or he'll be replaced. I know my nephew, the Baron said. This would only make him oppress the population even more. Of course he will, Hawat snapped. You don't want that stopped now. You merely want your own hands clean. Let Rabban make your Salusa Secundus for you. There's no need even to send him any prisoners. He has all the population required. If Rabban is driving his people to meet your spice quotas, then the Emperor need suspect no other motive. That's reason enough for putting the planet on the rack. And you, Baron, will not show by word or action that there's any other reason for this. The Baron could not keep the sly tone of admiration out of his voice. Ah, Hawat, you are a devious one. Now, how do we move into Arrakis and make use of what Rabban prepares? So you see what Thufir Hawat has just done, right? Thufir has devised a strategy whereby the Baron can not only potentially, possibly, get away with, escape the consequences of the gaffe that he made, but also potentially still profit by it, right? It's like eating your cake and having it too, right? As a side note, that expression always puzzled me throughout my childhood. I always asked with great simple-mindedness, but how can you eat a cake that you don't have? And I have since come to realize exactly what that means. Like, keep it, right? That is, to preserve your beautiful cake untouched, but also to eat it. I was pretty simple. Gerald Michael says it's more like eating your cake and taking someone else's also. Yeah, it is kind of like that. But anyway, so he's gonna get away with doing what he, oh no, Seleucus Secundus. Oh, no, I'm not. I have no plans, right? I'm totally not trying to train up like an alternative Sardaukar unit. No, not at all. While still creating the conditions to train up an alternative Sardaukar unit, right? So he is showing him how he can not only deflect the Emperor's attention to the plan that he did not have. The Baron didn't plan that, right? And it was not boldness; it was ignorance. Clearly, in retrospect, we're told clearly it wasn't boldness on the Baron's part; it was ignorance that led him to say those things to Count Fenring. He never tried to do that. He didn't know a thing about it. He didn't even know. Not only did he not plan to do it himself, he didn't even know what the Emperor was doing. He didn't even know the role of Seleucus Secundus in the training of the Sardaukar. Had no clue, right? So Thufir's plan will allow him to sort of show, oh, no, I didn't know, but also let him receive the fruit of doing it as if he had known and had been planning it in fact all along, right? That's just fascinating, right? That's really what a devious plan by Thufir Hawat, right? But wait, there's more, right? What's Thufir's plan? We know it isn't to make the Harkonnen succeed. We know it isn't to, Baron Harkonnen says, oh, he's focused on his true enemy, right? He's his hatred for me is a casual thing now. He's really just trying to get back at the Emperor. So the Baron believes, as he's believed all along, that he's using Thufir Hawat, right? He's going to use Thufir Hawat in his desire for vengeance. Thufir Hawat wants to bring down the Emperor. The Baron is quite cheerfully looking forward to seeing that happening, right? But that's not just Thufir's plan, right? This scene, what fascinates me about Chapter 2 in Book 3, I'll call it Chapter 2, even though it's not numbered as would be convenient, but in Chapter 2 of Book 3, we get a very different narrative approach from Chapter 1. Remember, Chapter 1 is where we were getting all of that, people's words and people's thoughts and the sort of the interplay between people's words and thoughts. And now we're not getting that. We get it occasionally in this scene, but much, much less. And at the same time, we are prompted to look at Baron Harkonnen in a completely different way. Do you notice that? Do you notice how smart Baron Harkonnen sounds in chapter 1, right? He's the man on top of things. And that moment when it sounds like he's literally reading Feyd-Rautha's mind, right? You think of me as an old fool. It's like, dude, right? The Baron is good, right? The Baron knows all. And now in chapter 2, the Baron sounds like a complete imbecile, right? The Baron doesn't know anything. The Baron is so slow on the uptake, and Thufir Hawat has to be like, I will use small words so you can attempt to understand. Exactly, Philbord was just typing that. He seemed like an idiot in this scene. He absolutely does seem like an idiot in this scene. I think that the contrast there, I think, is really fascinating. There's several sort of conclusions, several things that I think that we can sort of see from that. One is that, again, it depends on what grid you're looking through, right? Chapter 1 is basically told from the Baron's point of view. Again, we keep hopping back and forth and we see what Feyd-Rautha is thinking. But the Baron is the central figure of that chapter. Chapter 2 is much more focused, certainly in this conversation, on Thufir, right? And in the context of this conversation, it seems that we're being shown the Baron more as he appears to Thufir Hawat than as he thinks of himself, right? Anyway, I think it's really fascinating how that's being handled. One of the things that we can take from that, it seems, again, is that we can't always trust what we think. Again, like last time when we were doing our own speculation, we were doing our own readings. Okay, why is the Baron saying these things? Is he just making a mistake, or is he doing something devious? Did Thufir Hawat do something devious, right? Did Thufir Hawat somehow manipulate him into saying this in front of Count Fenring? And as we do that, right, again, as we do this thing that the book has been sort of training us to do this interpretation, this chapter is like a reminder. When you do that, you're often wrong, right? Sometimes when you read into the implications behind, there's not actually implications behind what they're saying. Sometimes somebody is actually just clueless, right? And I'm still not 100% sure about Thufir Hawat. I mean, this scene shows that the Baron clearly was not being bold or devious in the previous scene, right? That we know that he doesn't even have the data that would be needed to formulate the plan, which it sounds like he's hinting at in the scene with Count Fenring, right? So he clearly didn't mean that. I am less than 100% certain that Thufir Hawat didn't manipulate him into it. Now, I know that there's counter-evidence to that in this passage, right? Thufir Hawat doesn't even seem to know. He's like, what? You said what? It's very important. Tell me exactly what he said, right? And then he's like, how can we recover this? He clearly didn't know that conversation happened, right? That the Baron had said those things. Does that mean that he wasn't planting that in some sense? I'm less sure of that. I think it's quite possible that he is acting here like, oh my gosh, you did, Baron, I can't believe you did that, right? And then the Baron's all like, and not in a frame of mind to suspect that he's being played by Thufir Hawat. So again, it's possible. I personally leave the door open to the fact that this whole thing is playing out exactly as Thufir Hawat had planned. Even the possibility that Thufir Hawat knew full well about the conversation that Count Fenring had with the Baron, and the fact that Count Fenring went off and knew these things and started acting on these things. But it fits Thufir Hawat's motives for the Baron to think that Thufir Hawat only now realizes this, right? Because it will explain why Thufir Hawat did nothing to thwart it. It's like, oh, dude, man, if you don't give me data, I can't process it, man, right? So, it's I still have my suspicions that Thufir had all of that planned. Um, and Michael, I agree with you. Michael Chiskovsky is pointing out how amazing it is that Thufir Hawat has suddenly become amazingly adept and devious compared with how he was with the Atreides. Absolutely so. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that. On the one hand, I think it's possible, not probable, but possible that we were wrong. I think it's unlikely, but that is to say, it could be a question of grid again, right? Um, as we said at the time, and I was saying it pretty strongly, right through for how it looked like kind of an idiot when he kept screwing up, and we saw little that seemed to any sort of we saw little immediate justification for the the high praise and great reputation that we're told Thufir Hawat has. Now here, when he is in the service of the theoretically in the putative service of the Harkonnens, we see a great deal more of it. He seems to have earned his reputation a lot more, which leads me to wonder: was he more on top of things, back in the day than it seemed like he was? Yeah, Neil Ottenstein says it's also a matter of what data he has. This is certainly true. And Neil, I agree. Certainly, we still see that his blind eye towards Jessica, his and what seems to be, even in the way that he talks about it, almost an unwillingness to confront the data that he does have. Right? He's like, just amazing. What a poisonous hatred she must have had for the Atreides to turn into, to destroy her own son. I mean, wow. Right? She's really twisted. That's actually not the way the data points. Right? It's just not. It is a possible interpretation, but it is less plausible than others. And anyway, so yeah, James Stevens is reminding us of the first time we met Thufir Hawat, when he thinks of himself, he identifies himself with the battered fighting dummy, right? Yeah, I mean, and I think that's interesting. That's kind of revealing. It is almost like it is his failure, which he recognizes as a failure, right? His failure to calculate accurately. They were so close, right? He knew exactly what the Harkonnens' plan was going to be. He knew precisely what the trap that they were walking into was. They even anticipated the Sardaukar coming in Harkonnen uniforms. I mean, everything. They knew all that stuff. But he got the scale drastically, fatally, horribly wrong. So anyway, so he's screwed up. He failed to identify the traitor. He failed to anticipate the scope of the assault. The response to that failure has been his greatest work, right? And let's keep an eye on this. I want to come back to this next time when we see Thufir Hawat at the end of the story. We're not going to get a lot of description of his plans. The question that the Baron himself asks in this chapter, he knows Thufir Hawat is plotting, right? What's he plotting? He says, how does this? He's thinking of, how when Thufir is finally told that the Baron's plan, for Arrakis is to bring in Feyd-Rautha as a savior and for everybody to love him. And he, Thufir pauses and he thinks about it and he pauses and he says, I love this plan. It's a great plan. Yeah. Let's have Feyd-Rautha be the savior. And the Baron, to his credit, is immediately suspicious, right? Like, I wonder how this fits in with Hawat's own private plans, right? We're not going to get much more reference to Hawat's private plans in the rest of this book. We will meet Thufir Hawat again, but it's not going to be we're not going to be explicitly told what Hawat's plans were and how or if they come to fruition. So let's think about that. Pay attention to that next time. Again, it's just sort of left to us to sort of think through and interpret. Okay, I want to talk about Um, I want to talk about Aaliyah a little bit. Sorry, I'm getting a little thing in my throat. I think my voice will survive, but it won't be like that awful time last semester in my Chaucer class and doing my Canterbury Tales class. And I was trying to teach on the Nun's Priest Tale, which is like my favorite Chaucer story, and my voice just like totally went. It was just awful, so painful, both literally and figuratively. I think I'll be okay. All right. Um, Aaliyah's strangeness. Two things I want to think about with Aaliyah. And again, many of the questions, I mean, most of the questions, arguably all of the questions we're going to ask tonight, are not really answered fully. But my focus is I want to bring them up so that we think about them as we look at the end of the story over the next 2 weeks. Here are my questions primarily about Aaliyah. First of all, I want to make sure we understand what's going on with Aaliyah, right? So my question is as simple as, what really are we seeing? What really is going on with Aaliyah? But my second question is, why? How does it connect with the rest of the story? How does it fit with the other? She is, yeah, this is fair to say, the only real new character we get in book 3, right? We get the Baron and Feyd-Rautha and Thufir Hawat and Jessica and Paul and Stilgar and Cheney and but we don't see really, and Gurney. We don't really, but we don't. The only really new element of the story is Aaliyah. So why? How does Aaliyah relate to? Because I mean, we have what has happened with Paul, right, which we looked at the end of book 1. As we get to the end of book 2, we see something happening to Jessica, right? This change of awareness comes upon Paul at the end of book 1. This change of awareness comes upon Jessica at the end of book 2, and of course upon her unborn daughter. The similarities, the connection, therefore, between Aaliyah and Paul, emphasized by the fact that that they're siblings, right? That they're brother and sister. It seems to me very enticing. There's clearly something here that we need to think about. Something here we need to figure out. I don't think Aaliyah was just kind of tossed in there because she's cool. There's what is the relationship between her own experience and the nature of her situation and Paul, and the way that she had an awareness come upon her, right, and he had an awareness come upon him. Similarities, differences. How do we see this? How do we work with this? Anyway, let's so keeping those things in mind, let's look at a couple of Aaliyah passages. Seeing her daughter, Jessica was caught, as she frequently was, by Aaliyah's resemblance to Paul at that age. The same wide-eyed solemnity to her questing look, the dark hair and firmness of mouth. But there were subtle differences too, and it was in these that most adults found Aaliyah disquieting. The child, little more than a toddler, carried herself with a calmness and awareness beyond her years. Adults were shocked to find her laughing at a subtle play of words between the sexes, or they'd catch themselves listening to her half-lisping voice, still blurred as it was by an unformed soft palate, and discover in her words sly remarks that could only be based on experiences no 2-year-old had ever encountered. Hera sank to a cushion with an exasperated sigh, frowned at the child. Aaliyah, Jessica motioned to her daughter. The child crossed to a cushion beside her mother, sank to it, and clasped her mother's hand. The contact of flesh restored that mutual awareness they had shared since before Aaliyah's birth. It wasn't a matter of shared thoughts, although there were bursts of that, if they touched while Jessica was changing the spice poison for a ceremony. It was something larger, an immediate awareness of another living spark, a sharp and poignant thing, a nerve simpatico that made them emotionally one. Okay. What have we learned here? Observations. What do you see? What do we get from this? Okay, good. Interesting. Sharon Powell says, Aaliyah fits with the theme of the mouse unexpectedly turning out to be the most powerful creature around. It's neat, Sharon, in that way. It's almost, she's almost like a sort of an exaggerated figure of Paul, right? The child man, as Stilgar calls him, who bests Jameis without a wound on him, all of those kinds of things. Michael Chiskowski says, she seems to be a kind of like a Paul from birth, right? I see what you mean, right? That, what would it be like? No, she doesn't seem to have the same awareness. We'll look at that later. Where, the next passage I want to do is her own description of her experience. But I want to think about what's emphasized here in this passage, and what's emphasized here is the manner of the connection between Jessica and Aaliyah, right? And that's not a thing. And again, Aaliyah's experience is like Paul's in many ways. I'm not disagreeing with that. But the emphasis that we get here is not precisely that. She's not seeing herself as a nexus. She's not looking out over the undulating kerchief of time. We don't see that exactly. Anyway, more. Carissa is pointing out again the similarity to Paul. She was denied the choice of awareness; it was forced upon her. And we talked about the way in which Paul seems to be sort of invaded by, infected, again, being his word. Now, Joseph Cano says, I think Paul had much more urgency in his own awareness, but Aaliyah was never given a choice. I agree. We do see, like I was just saying, I do think, we see the awareness coming upon Paul, so in that way Aaliyah is kind of a figure for what happened to Paul. But Joseph, I think that your point is still an important one too. She's an exaggeration, right? Paul does have, or certainly believes himself to have more agency, more, I'm not sure control is quite the right way, but anyway, certainly more control than Aaliyah had, right? Aaliyah is the extreme example. Right, when this awareness comes upon her, in utero, she was only an embryo at the time. She is. I was going to say, was she an embryo or a fetus? No, I think she's an embryo because, again, we're told it's so early in the pregnancy, nobody else could even suspect for any reason. Good. Philip Lord points out how Jessica only gives birth to freaks. Yeah, pretty high freak quotient, I agree, among the Atreides children. Good. Trevor Brierly points out she's a mixture of adult and child. She still needs comforting like a child, even though she's far in advance, mentally and in her experience. Philip Lord says she's not quite what the Bene Gesserit wanted in a daughter. No, she's not. That's not how they planned it. It's kind of hard for Jessica anymore to say, well, see, look, I gave you the Atreides daughter you wanted. No, that wasn't the Atreides daughter they wanted, precisely. But I think even more importantly than that, that is, to some extent, she is, she's not quite what the Bene Gesserit wanted in a daughter, but in another sense, she's like, exactly what the Bene Gesserit wanted in a daughter, right? There is a sense in which Aaliyah is like the uber Bene Gesserit, right? She is like the embodiment of all things Bene Gesserit, again, to some extent. And I'm thinking here of the connection of the Reverend, she's born a Reverend Mother, right? I think she's born a Fremen Reverend Mother, but she's But we've got that connection between the Fremen Reverend Mother and the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers, and it's not just a traditional name thing, but the spice drug, right? The truth trance, the way that the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayam described it back in chapter. I don't remember the chapters because they're not numbered, but anyway, it's either 1 or 3, or maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, when her description of the truth drug and the truth trance, right, that comes upon you, and Jessica says, yeah, she recognizes this is pretty much the same thing. This is the experience that she has when she gets into the memories of all of the Reverend Mothers that have come before. That is like the experience of Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers. So again, Aaliyah is like the embodiment of the sort of ultimate, the highest level of Bene Gesseritude. And then, of course, we have heard, the description of her performing her Bene Gesserit training. And you kind of get the sense with Aaliyah that the kind of intensive mental and physical training that she's doing as part of her Bene Gesserit training is probably a little bit more advanced than it normally is for 2-year-olds. Yeah. Michael Cheskovsky points out that she looks into the past but not the future, right? Yeah, she only looks in one direction, not being the Kwisatz Haderach, right? But yes. Good. Yeah. Let's see. Good enough. Sorry, you guys are making lots of observations here, so I'm just sort of sifting through here. Yeah, Patrick points out that he says that he's always found her to be a sort of vaguely creepy or disquieting character, a child in body, but with these very non-childlike characteristics. Yeah, I think that's one of her functions, right? Disquieting. Yes, she's disquieting. There will be trouble over Aaliyah. But exactly those ways in which she's disquieting seem to be eye-opening in these particular ways. Again, especially some of those parallels to Paul that we were talking about before, right? Paul is also a freak, right? He is also unnatural in some of these ways. It's just more obvious with Aaliyah, right? She really draws attention to that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, no, Michael, I'm totally going to resist talking about Aaliyah in future books, of which I was not a fan, by the way. In fact, it was one of the things I disliked most about the later books. But anyway, well, I'm not going there. So not going there. Good. Yeah. No, Kevin, I'm not going to do it. Nope. Carolyn Morehouse says Paul's many years of humanness give him a perspective that Aaliyah is lacking because she was denied humanity. Yeah, exactly. She is immersed in this, and this brings me back to observation that Trevor Brierley made at the very beginning, which Trevor I skipped at the time because I didn't want to go here before we'd even read the passage. But I think your insight is really cool. He says, I think Aaliyah is the first manifestation we get of the terrible purpose. She's already aware in a way that Paul is only moving towards. The association between Aaliyah and the terrible purpose is, I think, a really fascinating one, because race consciousness sounds really quite a lot like what we see in the Reverend Mothers, right? The connection with Jessica talking about her body memory and all those things. This seems to be this seems to be one of the um, one of the ways in which she does kind of stand potentially as a symbol. I hesitate to make of Aaliyah a symbol because it would be easy to just sort of set her up purely as a symbol and therefore simplify her character. And I want to be cautious about that. But anyway, thinking of her as almost like a manifestation of the race consciousness, it's that, I think, which is one of the things that makes her experience most closely related to Paul. That's the sort of the link between the two of them, that sort of shared experience of this awareness coming upon them. Well, what is the awareness that comes upon them exactly? Again, Paul sees things differently. We've got the paths and the nexus, and Aaliyah doesn't talk like that, but what we do get is his insight into the race consciousness and even that image of infection that we've looked at before. Patrick says she's a Bene Gesserit without the burden or benefit of human experience, right? Again, in a sense, making her like the ideal Bene Gesserit, because she'll be with her mom at almost the opposite end, right? Her mom was a defective Bene Gesserit because she let her affection for her husband influence her, and she wasn't a good soldier, right? She wasn't a good Bene Gesserit. She defied her instructions. Aaliyah, and why? Why did Jessica do that? Well, for very human reasons, right? Because she loved the Duke. She wanted to please him. Aaliyah, she's not totally separate from her humanity. We do see her having human emotions. I don't want to underplay that. But again, there's this sense in which all of those things which sort of separate Jessica from the Bene Gesserits. Aaliyah doesn't have sort of exactly the sort of the same thing. Tom asks, isn't that what makes her an abomination, that she lacks the human experience? Yeah, well, no, she's got plenty of human experience, Tom, right? She's got many people's lifetime worth of human experience. That's why she gets all these jokes and is delivering innuendo in ways that seem shocking. She's got too much human experience. What she lacks is human identity in that sense, right? This sort of sense of who she is, right? Tom, not of her own, right? Not she doesn't have her own life. You think about, for instance, Aaliyah. If Aaliyah were to be passing her own memories on to the next Reverend Mother, right? What would she pass on? I mean, she has some memories of her own, but again, it's almost like she doesn't even have an existence outside of this consciousness, outside of this memory. Let's look at that passage too. Just when I felt safe and reassured, so Aaliyah's recalling back to the moment, the moment of her awakening. Aaliyah said, there was another spark with us, and everything was happening at once. The other spark was the old Reverend Mother. She was trading lives with my mother, everything, and I was there with them, seeing it all, everything. And it was over, and I was them and all the others and myself, only it took me a long time to find myself again. There were so many others. It was a cruel thing, Jessica said. No being should wake into consciousness thus. The wonder of it is that you could accept all that happened to you. I couldn't do anything else, Aaliyah said. I didn't know how to reject or hide my consciousness or shut it off. Everything just happened. Everything. We didn't know, Hera murmured. When we gave your mother the water to change, we didn't know you existed within her. And of course, Jessica did know that she existed within her, but didn't recognize, didn't think about what the drug would do to her. Right, exactly, Nancy. Jessica knew, but she didn't understand what the ritual was, what was behind this. Carissa says this scene breaks her heart. Yeah, it's a very moving scene. And again, that's fascinating. In Aaliyah, we're invited to see, again, this sort of creature, right, with almost no independent human experience, and yet our compassion for her is really stirred, right? She is certainly in our own thoughts humanized by this moment, if by no other, right? And yet we can see she's a freak, right? She's a monstrosity. We can sort of understand that. Um, yeah, yeah. Good. James Stevens says it really well. He says most Reverend Mothers are people first who then acquire this other awareness. She is the awareness first, has to discover herself. Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Um, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Philip, this is clearly fetal melange syndrome. Yeah, yeah, it's a rare condition, but pretty bad. Um, I didn't know how to reject or hide my consciousness. Um, yeah, yeah. Um, Again, see here, I think, in reading Aaliyah's experience, I can't help again thinking of Paul, um, and his own experience with his awareness, his own sense of his consciousness, and the way in which his awareness and thoughts of himself are um, changed, are sort of twisted as we go through. I'm not sure I'm going to get to the passages I wanted to talk about Paul's own experience. I should be. I have a hard stop tonight. I need to let you guys go closer to on time than usual. But anyway, we've got plenty of time. We'll finish that up next week. But I do want to look at a couple things briefly before, as we sort of merge into Paul, and that is I want to be thinking about what has happened in those 2 years. I come back to Neil, to your question that you emailed me about last week that I mentioned at the end of class last time, but didn't get a chance to talk about. Why the 2 years? I mean, and when I say why, I don't. I should stop. I shouldn't ask why questions because I don't really mean a why question. By why, I don't mean what was Frank Herbert thinking when he made this particular choice. I don't mean that, though it sounds like that's what I mean. What I mean is, what is the impact of those 2 years on our understanding of this story? How does it impact the story? It is conspicuous. Because it's, we have this book divided into three, this volume divided, this story divided into 3 books, right? But we didn't see that gap between book 1 and book 2. When book 2 ends, we have every reason to sort of expect that, like book 2, it's going to pick up right where book, where the last book left off. But it doesn't, right? Instead, we get a 2-year gap. What's the impact of that? How does that change? How does that gap change how we look at things? Well, one thing that it does is it moves Paul forward into, so now we see that he's in a different place, right? With relationship to his awareness and to his prescient memories and all of these things. That's what I think we're going to have to wait until next time to look at. But Neil, that's a great way to think about it. Neil says we don't see a gradual change in Paul's attitude. We see a sudden change, right? I agree. And Neil goes on to add, we're as surprised as Gurney is. Yeah, Paul's different, and we can perceive the differences, and we can perceive them much more clearly than we would had we been watching the slow development and change from the one state into the other. And of course, Nancy, you're right. Olia has to develop enough to have this conversation, right? Yes. Getting Aaliyah born again, but again, to some extent, there are plot reasons why it needs to happen. But to me, that's not the really interesting answer to the question. Again, that's not really the interesting direction of thinking about the question. To me, the really interesting direction is, again, how does it impact? What kind of change does it bring about? And Neil, I loved your suggestion about that. It does give us almost the opportunity to see Paul through fresh eyes, right? Let me know. Something odd seems to be happening with my computer. If you have audio or video problems, just let me know. if things get too strange. I hope it shouldn't, but just in case. Um, Sometimes GoToMeeting is a little alarmist in its warnings, so I'll hope that everything is okay. Um, okay, yeah, having video problems. Okay, as long as the audio is working, we'll be okay. We can live with it. As long as you're hearing the audio, okay. Okay, good. So tell me if you're hearing the audio, okay. All right, all right. Well, let's move on. I said I'm going to stop in just a minute anyway. So it sounds like I'm coming through for most people, so I'll carry on. I want to come at Paul, and exactly as Neil was suggesting, the ways in which Paul is different here, by looking at the different perspectives that we get on him, sort of the different points of view. And one of them, of course, comes from our friend Princess Irulan. Great, see, now I'm getting my rainbow wheel here. Okay, here we go. Good. Here's Princess Irulan's assessment in Muad'Dib, the religious issues. Notice how we get several new books in book 3. Did you notice that? I hope you've been paying attention to the titles as we've gone through. We get a number of new titles in book 3, which is fascinating. Anyway, you cannot avoid the interplay of politics within an Orthodox religion. This power struggle permeates the training, educating, and disciplining of the Orthodox community. Because of this pressure, the leaders of such a community inevitably must face that ultimate internal question: to succumb to complete opportunism as the price of maintaining their rule, or risk sacrificing themselves for the sake of the Orthodox ethic. Okay. Yeah, okay. Nancy, it's a fantastic question. Of course, we don't know the answer. Nancy says it makes her wonder even more about the publication dates of Princess Irulan's works. Are these ones that we're getting introduced to later in the story? Are these her later works? Or not? I do think it's a great question. Of course, we really don't have any good data on that point. But anyway. Yeah, good. Yeah, Josh asks a great question. She said, it makes me wonder things like, did Paul really make drums out of human skins? Yeah, that hasn't been confirmed, right? We're told that it's a rumor, but anyway. More on this quotation here, more from Princess Irulan. What do we see in this, and what are its implications for Muad'Dib, the religious issues? This passage strikes me as quite thoroughly cynical, right? This sounds to me as cynical as the Missionaria Protectiva. This seems to be spoken from the point of view of the Bene Gesserit grid, again, that same Bene Gesserit grid, which sees superstition and religion as a thing to be manipulated in order to achieve certain ends, without any real indication, it would seem, that there could be something in it, that there could be truth or reality in those things. It's the sham, as Jessica calls it. There seems to be, at least my reading of Princess Irulan's words here, are that she is implying the same kind of sham status of all of the Orthodox religious people here, right, that she's describing. The inevitable choice, right, the internal question that all leaders of Orthodox communities must inevitably face, according to Irulan, is, do they succumb to complete opportunism to maintain their rule, or risk sacrificing themselves for the sake of the Orthodox ethic? How I understand her language is not at its most transparent here, but how I understand Princess Irulan is that she's saying, okay, if you are the leader of an Orthodox religion, and by Orthodox I take her to be meaning a religion which states very clearly that some things are right and some things are wrong, and insists on an orthodoxy of belief among its adherents. If you are leading such a religion, a religion which is not flexible, which is not syncretistic, then you're gonna have a problem, right? If you make out like the orthodox ethic, right, the belief system of the religion is bigger than you might have to sacrifice to it, right? Um, you can't be sure how that's. If you want to be sure to stay on top, you have to be willing to be opportunistic, right? You've got to be willing to be flexible, which might mean compromising the orthodox ethic, right? If a certain challenge to your authority comes up, you might need to change the rules in order to stay in power. It could happen, right? So you have to decide which one is really bigger. Are you bigger than the Orthodox code, or is the Orthodox code bigger than you, right? This seems, again, this is my understanding of what Princess Irulan is saying here. So how does that apply to the religious issues of Muad'Dib? Well, again, the implication is, in my reading of the Princess Irulan's words here, I don't see much real scope for the question, what if the Orthodox ethic is, in fact, bigger than the leader, right? It's almost like, again, like the Missionaria Protectiva, there's this sort of assumption underlying her in the entire structure of her discussion here that sort of implies, granted that you as leader of a religious, of an Orthodox religion, are just manipulating this for the sake of your own power, right? That fundamentally it's kind of a political thing anyway, right? Granted that you're just trying to manipulate it for your own ends, you're going to be confronted with this, and you got to figure out how to negotiate it, right? That assumption, again, and which I take to be a quite cynical assumption, just as I was suggesting, that we could see a cynical assumption in the Missionaria Protectiva outlook, right? And I think we can see a similar one here. This is a really fascinating, this little chapter starter, this quotation from Princess Irulan has a different and more immediate kind of relevance to the story that's happening around it, I think, than we see in many of her other quotations. Again, sometimes we'll see, like when she gives us the passage about the Duke Leto leading into, one of the chapters about Duke Leto. I'm not saying that they're not sometimes relevant like that, but rarely are they making an explicit sort of commentary upon it, or really sort of prepping us to understand things or inviting us to sort of contextualize the whole thing in a particular way. But anyway, yeah. Josh asks, can we see this playing out with Paul and Stilgar? To an extent, yeah. I mean, Josh, the question of sacrificing yourself for the sake of the Orthodox ethic, ways change, right? Josh, that does seem to play exactly into what Irulan is describing here, right? But I'm not sure that makes her right. Just because her description is apt doesn't necessarily mean that her assumptions are correct. I think there's plenty of evidence in this book that the Bene Gesserit grid is inadequate. I think that we were prompted to see that way back at the beginning, when Paul could see through, or rather hear through, because of his truth sense, his instinct for rightness. Remember that, how the Reverend Mother is explaining to him about how the truth drug works, and all of those things, and he was saying, she believes what she's saying, but she's wrong. That's not how it is. That's not what really happens. And Gerald, yeah, I do think Iroan is channeling the Bene Gesserit grid in this quote. This sounds to me like a very pure version, a very pure illustration of the Bene Gesserit grid. So again, so we see the way in which Princess Irulan gives us this one grid through which to look at Paul and the Muad'Dib thing and what's going on with Paul, what has been happening for the last 2 years, and where we are in the process now. To me, even more interesting is what we get from Jessica. Jessica was fearful of the religious relationship between himself and the Fremen, Paul knew. She didn't like the fact that people of both the one or two syllabled Sietch, as I said I will call it, both Sietch and Graben referred to Muad'Dib as him. And she went questioning among the tribes, sending out her Sayadina spies, collecting their answers and brooding on them. She had quoted a Bene Gesserit proverb to him: "When religion and politics travel in the same cart, the riders believe nothing can stand in their way. Their movement becomes headlong, faster and faster and faster. They put aside all thought of obstacles, and forget that a precipice does not show itself to the man in a blind rush until it's too late." Okay, now, as I said in my subtitle, Jessica is late to the party here. She is late in being worried about the religious partnership between Paul and the Fremen, right? Paul's been worried about that for a long time. We see him worrying about that because nobody is more familiar with the whole the issue of runaway carts, right? He's been afraid of the runaway cart that is the jihad for a long time. Good. Patrick and Gerald are both saying flashing jihad warning signs here. Yeah, exactly. There could be a precipice up ahead, and Paul has known this. Remember that scene that we looked at, in not last class, but in the end of Book 2 class, about where he says, my mother is my enemy, right? She is acting to bring about the jihad, and we talked about that, how very understandable it is for Jessica to do what she does, right? And we were asking the question, what does winning look like, right? What will success look like? What's the alternative to the jihad? And we don't really know. But now we see Jessica, who is all like, yeah, we got to play on that. She's playing up to the religious connection, right? She is trying to manipulate it Bene Gesserit style, right? Missionaria Protectiva style. And now she's worried, right? Now she's... Nancy, I agree. Nancy Fosberg says, she's laughing at the Bene Gesserit having a proverb like that, right? Like, this really long and sort of comical idea of, this crowded cart plunging over a precipice. I agree. It does seem an unexpectedly sort of funny and homey kind of comparison, Nancy. Yeah, good. Gerald says, okay, Jessica is now realizing this might be a bad thing, or there might be some negative consequences of this, but she takes no credit for having helped things to get to this state. Her own lack of awareness, lack of recognition, right, that she was, well, I won't say to blame, but again, that she was his enemy, right? She was trying to bring the situation, not knowing that it was going to bring the jihad, but deliberately trying to bring this situation about. And now she's worried, right? Now she's concerned and thinks that it might be dangerous. Michael says she's flashing the warning signs after the cart's gone over the cliff already. Again, like, she doesn't need, Paul doesn't need to be told about headlong plunges over cliffs. He's been looking at that. Okay, well, let's pause here until next week, and I want to come back and I want to start off by looking at where Paul's own perspective is, what has changed, not just in our outlook towards him, when we'll continue talking about that, but Paul's own outlook, Paul's own experiences. What's different now? What do we see changing? And then we will work our way towards the ending. But I don't make even the vaguest and most optimistic promise of finishing up all of our discussions of Book 3 next time. So we'll see how far we get. But I think we'll definitely be using all of our last weeks. But anyway, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for bearing with a few brief technical glitches, and we will. I will see you guys next week for moving closer to the end of the story. Don't forget to vote. If you haven't voted yet, don't forget to log on and vote for the next book that we're going to talk about in the next class. And if you haven't gotten a chance to contribute to our campaign yet, I strongly recommend that you do so. I urge you to do so. We are we have been able to do really great things this past year with the donations that you guys gave us last year. So, I certainly ask you guys to help us to keep this going. And again, let's see if we can expand the program. Let's see if we can add on some new things for next year if we can continue with the campaign. So, thanks very much, everybody, and I will see you guys next week. Good night.